So you just got a camera. You set it up and you're ready to start shooting, but now you have a decision to make. What frame rate do you shoot in? So you go to the place where you get all your other information, Google. And it tells you to shoot in
24 frames per second.
24 frames per second.
Shoot in 24 frames per second.
Why?
More cinematic.
Natural to the human eye.
Most true to life.
It's a little bit complicated.
Basically, it's just the best and it doesn't really matter why. This was basically the answer I got to when I started making videos, and for a long time, I just set my camera to 24 frames per second and called it good. But as someone who considers himself a video guy, I can't keep letting this slide. So today it's my goal to explain exactly where our frame rates come from and also figure out, is 24 frames per second actually the best frame rate to be shooting in?
First of all, there's a common misconception that I think we need to address, and that's the myth that 24 frames per second is the most like human vision. It's hard to say exactly where this idea came from, but I think it's in large part due to language like realistic or lifelike. Which is wrong for a few reasons, but to explain why, we need to get into some specifics on what exactly video is. When you shoot a video, your camera exposes the sensor for a certain amount of time based on your shutter speed. If your shutter speed is 1/50, that's 1/50th of a second. It then converts that information into a photo, which we call a frame. The number of those frames your camera captures per second is your frame rate. Frame rate can also refer to how fast those frames are played back, but we can't just use any frame rate we want. If the frames aren't displayed fast enough, the result will just look like a series of still images played one after the other. This is because video relies on a feature of the eye called persistence of vision. When we look at something, that image remains in our vision for a short time before completely fading. This is the reason that fast-moving objects appear blurry. The amount of time this takes is different for each person, but in general, it's about 1/10 of a second. And this is what's important for video. As long as the next frame is displayed before the previous one is completely faded from your vision, to the human eye, that looks like continuous motion. 1 second. So because your persistence of vision lasts about 1/10 of a second, the lowest frame rate video can be is about 10 frames per second or higher. So our eyes see in 10 frames per second then? No. No, they don't. People seem to really like the idea that our eyes see in the same way that a camera sees. I mean, if you look at a thing and then you look at a video of a thing, they look the same, but in reality, it's just not as simple as that. Your eyes are constantly taking in tons of information about motion, color, depth, and form, which is then being processed and altered by the brain to create the experience that we call vision. All this is to say, we don't see in a frame rate. A video can do its best to simulate that experience, but at the end of the day, that's just not what vision looks like. So while you may be able to see some visual differences between them, whether it's 10, 24, or 120 frames per second, there's just no frame rate that looks any more or less like human vision. They just look like video. Also, before we get too far into this, I just want to mention, finding a cohesive answer to this question of where does 24 frames per second come from was shockingly difficult. Just lots of conflicting information and not a whole lot of consensus on where specifically it came from, but after doing the digging, this is where I got. All right, let's get started. Back in the early days of silent film, video was shot at 16 frames per second. Why 16? Because it was about as slow as they could get away with while selling the smooth video effect.
Video at the time was shot entirely on film, which was expensive to buy and process, so they didn't want to use any more than necessary. This may seem cheap or like corner cutting, but it's just practical. There was no need to shoot at any higher frame rate. So then, why change it all? Well, for a long time they didn't. At this time, there were dozens of attempts at sound on film technology, which in large part were ignored. The new equipment was expensive to use and difficult to operate, and at the time, movies were still a relatively new thing, and audiences were still selling out theaters for silent films. So there just wasn't a lot of motivation to develop this new technology. That is until the 1927 hit, The Jazz Singer. This wasn't the first attempt at synchronized sound on film, but it was the first movie that showed studios it could be successful. At a time when most advertising was done through word of mouth, The Jazz Singer was selling out theaters across the country. It was so successful that it started an entirely new era of sound on film. These are the movies that today we refer to as talkies. And the crazy part is, it only had 2 minutes of actual dialogue.
If I'm a success in this show, well, we're going to move from here. Oh yes, we're going to move up in the Bronx.
But why am I telling you all this? By this point, there were several different technologies developed to do synchronized audio and video, but the one used on The Jazz Singer was a device called the Vitaphone. The Vitaphone was simply a combination of a film camera and a vinyl audio recorder, with its important feature being that they were driven by the same motor. This made it very rare for the audio and video to fall out of sync, a common problem at the time. But more importantly for our purposes, the creators settled on a film put-through rate of 90 feet per minute, which, if you do the math, comes out to 24 frames per second. While the Vitaphone was a revolutionary piece of technology, it also sucked, so it was quickly replaced with sound on film technology. But to match the Vitaphone projectors that were in nearly every theater at the time, they also decided on a frame rate of 24 frames per second. And as they say in the movies, the rest is history.
And now, 100 years later, 24 frames per second is just the undisputed go-to frame rate for movies. And it's not because it looks the most natural, it's because at this point, 24 frames per second is just what a movie looks like. Movies have just been shot this way for so long that 24 frames per second is basically synonymous with movies themselves. Okay, this is all interesting, but then at the end of the day, when you turn on your camera, does this actually change anything about the way you shoot? Well, I didn't realize it when I started this video, but yes. For years now, I have been a tried and true 24 FPS videographer, all the time. But doing research for this video has made me question that a lot. So it's time we considered the other frame rate in our cameras. 30 FPS. 30 frames per second was standardized for American broadcast television because it matched the frame rate of home TVs. Eventually there was a system developed to play 24 frames per second movies over broadcast, but in general, from the early 1900s up until today, if something is shot for broadcast television, it's shot in 30 FPS. Which brings us to today, where on 99% of cameras, the two frame rates you're gonna see are 24 and 30. Not counting like high frame rates, 60 and 120 and stuff. Not counting that. You can also thank the broadcast television system for frame rates like these. But because 30 frames per second comes from broadcast television, there's an association that it looks bad. If 24 frames per second looks like a movie, then 30 frames per second looks like cheap sitcoms and commercials. Not a great reputation. Today, this translates to a still surprisingly strong perception that 30 frames is a lesser frame rate. But what if I told you that for many cases today, 30 is actually the best frame rate to be using? Ultimately, if there's anything I want you to take away from this video, it's that the frame rate you choose should be based on the platform it's going to be shown on. If you're making something to be shown in theaters, then 24 frames per second might be the best frame rate to choose. But let's be real here, if there's one place that most videos are going to these days, it's social media. The question of the best frame rate for social media has been debated online a number of times, but after looking into it a little bit, I've been convinced that 30 frames per second is the way to go. When you upload a video to social media, it's going to run it through a compression format. And that compression is different depending on which platform you're uploading to. But in general, the closer you can get a video to the compression format, the less it's going to be altered and the better it's going to look in the end. A quick Google search can show you some best practices for each social media platform.
Instagram, for instance, recommends a minimum of 30 frames per second for every video uploaded. According to YouTube, you can upload in 24 or 30 or many other frame rates without issues. But at the same time, there's a lot of anecdotal evidence of people experiencing stuttering when uploading 24 frames per second to YouTube. Also, these days, a lot of people are uploading the same video to all social media platforms, in which case it's probably best to use the one that works for all of them. But whether or not 30 frames per second is the best frame rate for social media, what I really want you to take away from this video is to be intentional about your frame rate. And you should always choose the frame rate that's best for the particular video that you're making. And remember, at the end of the day, 99% of people are not going to tell the difference between 24 or 30 frames per second. The benefits are really just for you, the video creator. Choosing the correct frame rate is the best way to ensure that the video that you share looks the same as it did in your editing software. Also, I think the whole set it and forget it mentality is just kind of unprofessional. For those of you working with clients, it's part of your job to know what you're setting on your camera and why. And having good specific reasons for things like this not only increases your confidence, but it also increases your value quite a bit. All right, I think that's all I've got for this video. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you soon.